Cuba is an environment of diverse language, exotic food, and a place like nothing else. Most of the few tourists reveal the gorgeous beachy country located in Central Caribbean, highlighting spectacular music and cultural features, thanks to its breathtaking climate. Advanced in beautiful weather and resorts true to its tourists, Cuba seems great. However, fancy clothing, dancers, and cooled cars may trick you. Unfortunately, the government is a disaster on a pretty beach. If you don't work at high positions from the unbalanced economy, you live in poverty. Attempts to run a successful country have led to U.S. conflicts and an unruly dictator. Cuba is one of the few monarchies in the Western Hemisphere, along with disastrous Venezuela and drug-addicted Colombia. As we step back into history, notice the revolts and brawls that have shaped cultures of the U.S. and Cuba. Heading into pure revolution, we start in 1930, near the end of the Batista era. During World War II, Cubans began to think Batista's regime in ways were not enough to run Cuba, for he was the president. Parties like the PRC, an authentic party, were failing to live up to the revolution, so Cuba needed a new way of regime and how Cuba should be run. So, revolution groups like Fidel Castro and students overthrew Batista, and they continuously began destruction of armies and institutions. Anti-revolutionist Fidel Castro took power in his hands in 1959. Fidel put new ideas ahead and took out Batista's ways, converting Cuba to a dictator-ran country. John F. Kennedy and the Americans did not approve. Officially, in 1961, Cuba became communist. JFK took 14,000 Cuban exiles, paratroopers, and bombers to ambush Cuban air bases. JFK had a goal to put a stop to communism and become allies. Unfortunately, the mighty Cuban Air Force took out 20,000 attackers, then a storm rolled overhead. The war was over for the Americans. JFK negotiated $53 million in medicine and baby food for his hostages, but the mishap led to the Cold War in 1962. Cuba cut ties with the U.S. quickly. Fidel Castro needed help. The Cuban army could not outmatch the Americans. Castro soon ordered Latin terrorists and nuclear power from the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, for Cuban soldiers. The missiles lined up 90 miles off the coast of Florida. JFK notified the U.S. citizens and blockaded the coast from Cuba and planned for an ultimatum. The crucial time was named the Cold War, for it was a series of threats with teams of equal power. Cubans shot down American planes, and the U.S. Navy prepared to strike back. Luckily, Nikita suggested to remove his missiles for Cuban independence from invasion. This leveled out everyone. JFK removed his missiles from Turkey. The Soviets removed the missiles from Cuba. However, Cuba was still left. They had ballistic missiles in Russia, capable of deteriorating in the U.S. But the whole Cuban economy depended on Russia. Skipping ahead, in 1990, communism began to fall. The Soviets left Cuba on their own, ending the tense Cold War. Cuba had a huge economic crisis. Their fine exporting/importing jobs became worse, dropping drastically. The budget deficit worsened. The Cuban citizens could not escape it, for the U.S. dropped all immigration and ties with Cuba. The Caribbean countries suffered. Europe and Soviets stopped trade, and Cuba lost big-time money. Now Raul Castro is trying to recover Cuba from what his relative Fidel has lost. This has shaped the Cuban culture for now. For Raul Castro, the new dictator to ease communism. Throughout history, Cuba has depended on many other countries and has been shaped by big events and others.
Welcome everyone to the beginning history of Cuba. Today I'm just going to be talking about the natives and the early settlement of Cuba over a period of time. Most of the things that I will deal with in this documentary are Cuba's most important main things. After all, when Christopher Columbus was first sailing in the Caribbean Sea and found this big part of land, the discovery by the Italian explorer Christopher Columbus was at the time of 1492. After Columbus's arrival, Cuba became a Spanish colony. Start off, we're going to be talking about the natives that first landed in Cuba. Cuban natives, the home to the beginners on the great big land in the Caribbean Sea. This land was home to these first groups of natives that lived there. These groups were called Taino, Arawak Indian peoples. There were also these groups called Cabanis and Guadalupe's. The Guadalupe's were on this land for the longest period of time. These natives were known as the Shell, which meant culture, a society of hunters and gatherers who used natural materials. Their few artifacts display certain similarities of inhabitants in Florida. It is speculated that they came from the south of the United States. Diego Velázquez was Cuba's first conqueror and first Spanish governor. So after Diego Velázquez thought the first group he saw, Guadalupe's, were savages, he thought these people were ironic. As we get deeper into the Cuban natives, next we are going to be talking about their lifestyle. Their two cultures, the Cabanis and the Tanos, had something to do with the larger South American Arawak group. It seemed that the Taino tribes were first forced westward about 200 years before the Spanish arrival. The Tanos had found a paradise open area available for very thrivable of their peaceful lifestyle. With the Tanos and their salvation, the other tribe, the Cabanis, eventually became servants of the Tanos. Fun fact about Tanos societies. They did traditional activities of fishermen and hunters and introduced agriculture to the island. Their agriculture included maize, which is corn, beans, squash, peanuts, yucca, and tobacco. The Tanos lived in these homes called bayayos. They were made out of cane or bamboo. They were ruled by caciques and bethincus. These homes had people that consisted of priests, doctors, and chiefs. The Taino men wore no clothes. The women wore small cotton aprons that covered them in front of the waist to their knees. So, as we move on through this documentary, we are going to be starting to learn about the early settlement that happened in Cuba. Comes to my mind. What influenced the Spanish colony to come invade Cuba? Well, when you think about it, Columbus's voyage had set off into many places down in the Caribbean. And he planned to find a lot of places, and he circled around. He visited all land that he could find. But when he came to Cuba, he thought the view was great, the place was a great place, and it was a great place to be thrivable and a place to live. So when the Spanish colony came in from all over, Spain, British, all those people, but now it's mostly Spanish people who live there, people who are Spaniards. As Columbus arrived back in Spain, he had told all of the Spanish colony that he had found land. And when the Spanish moved in, they had attacked the natives and killed them all, and then they became their own Spanish colony in Cuba. That's why it's known as the largest state with most Spanish people to be living there. Now, as we move in to wrap up this documentary, we are going to finish off with early settlement in Cuba. After Christopher Columbus had found this place, the Spanish colony started kicking in and becoming a place for the Spaniards and the British to start using this country for their own good use. Like when Havana was briefly occupied by Great Britain, and then Cuba became ruled by a Spanish governor in Havana in 1762, before being returned into Spain in exchange for Florida. When the Spanish immigration began 1492, Columbus's journey started over in Spain. On his way of exploring the Western Hemisphere, he had been sailing south to find more places. In first, Columbus found the Bahamas, which he found on 27th or 28th of October 1492. On his voyage, he had ran into Cuba, and after that, Diego Velázquez sent out 300 men on ships to encounter the Hispaniola, which is what they called the island once that happened, the Spanish settlement began. When the settlers came, they were greeted with strong enough greeting from the local people who were part of the Taino population. Soon Diego Velázquez, conqueror of New Island, had kicked the Taínos out of the island and burnt alive, and soon got their island in 1514. Thank you for watching this part of the documentary. I just took you through a basic walkthrough of the early settlements and the natives that were there in Cuba over a period of time. I hope you enjoyed watching this.
Only 485 miles away from Florida lies neighboring country Cuba. In 1492, this island was discovered by Christopher Columbus and was used as a rest stop for Spain. When Cuba finally regained their independence from Spain, their first dictatorship took place. This has and still is affecting the country of Cuba tremendously. Before Spain conquered Cuba in 1492, there were the Taino people living on the land. These people worked the land and had their own cultures and religions. That was until the Spaniards came and changed everything. Christopher Columbus came to the island to claim it for Spain. This was a special piece of land for Spain and was put to use. The island of Cuba was used for a rest stop for the Spanish who were traveling along the coast. As for the Taino people, their lives became miserable. They became slaves and lost everything. They were not even allowed to keep their religions because the Spaniards weaved their cultures and religions into the Taino people. The effects of Spain coming and conquering Cuba had a very large effect on the native people who were drawn away from their ways of life. This was until the Taino people became mad and declared war on Spain. This was hard for the Taino people because Spain had the more advanced weapons and the Taino people just had spears and homemade weapons. Surprisingly, the Taino people held up for 10 years before surrendered. At the end of the war, almost the entire Taino tribe was wiped out. All that remained were the remainder of the Spaniards and a very small amount of the native tribe. Many decades later, Cuba regained their independence from Spain. This was only until the first dictatorship took place. In 1924, Gardo Mantuno took over Cuba. This man was a general, so power came very easily. During this time, there was a lot of economical development and slavery. This was a very big event that took place in Cuba's history because it was their first ever form of government. That was because Spain had owned them before this time. The dictatorships have been passed down through Cuba's history and are still in full gear today. In Cuba, there have been some big events that have affected them tremendously, like every other country. One of these big events was on October 19, 1960. The U.S. broke relationship with Cuba. This meant that the U.S. stopped trading goods, and nor Americans or Cubans were allowed to enter either country. Another big event was obviously their first dictatorship. This was good and bad for the country because at this time they needed a type of government. But it also didn't allow the Cubans to be free, as would have been hoped for every successful society. The government has affected the people in many ways, and they still are unexplained. But even with an unnormal government, their society and their cultures are doing
Cuba is a lovely place, from its radiant turquoise waters to the emerald green mountain tops of the Sierra Maestra. I'll be giving you a visual of the colorful Cuba, and I'll be showing you its geography, from its nice climate and beautiful landscapes. Cuba is south of Key West, Florida, and lies in the middle of the Caribbean. It even has the North Atlantic Ocean bordering it, and the turquoise waters of the Caribbean Sea. Not only does Cuba have bodies of water bordering it, Cuba has its very own bodies of water. For example, Catu River is Cuba's largest body of water. It ranges through Sierra Maestra to the west of the Caribbean Sea. Although this water is not drinkable, Catu River is used as a transport waterway. On the other hand, Cuba also has some major landforms, like Sierra Maestra. First of all, Sierra Maestra is Cuba's largest mountain range, with the highest point at 6,476 feet, commonly known as Pico Turquino. Sierra Maestra is also the highest system of Cuba. For instance, it is rich in minerals, especially in copper, corium, and iron. The climate of Cuba is semi-tropical or temperate, which makes the mean temperature of Cuba 77 degrees Fahrenheit. The sea breezes and trade winds make coastal regions more habitable, like Havana. Because of this, Havana is the most populated city since it's a habitable region. Cuba does have a rainy season from May to October, which gets about 35 through 55 inches of rain. On the other hand, droughts seem to occur on the eastern coast of Cuba in January. Hurricanes often hit the eastern coast of Cuba, which can result in a great economic loss, like Hurricane Sandy. Cuba has a brightly colored selection of flora and fauna. First of all, Cuba is home to the smallest bird species, the bee hummingbird. The bee hummingbird only grows to be 2 inches and weighs less than a dime. The Cubans call it Sun and believe that it's a symbol of love. Second of all, the fauna in Cuba is beautiful and lively. The white mariposa is a white flower that's a symbol of purity, rebelliousness, and independence. They can be found in human places like lagoons. I hope that you have a better visual understanding of Cuba. Thanks for watching.